Lystra and Derbe. Question?
I'm a little confused. So Paul and Barnabas are traveling along. They're going into the synagogues, which are
Yes.
of Jewish control.
Yes.
And they're converting people, or people are rejecting them.
Yes.
So where then do they go to kind of celebrate the sacrament, the Eucharist, and what's going on with that?
Okay, so if you didn't hear the question, or I'm told that it's better if I say the question again over the mic so everyone can hear, the pattern is they're checking in a local synagogue, and then division occurs. Where's the sacramental life being celebrated? So there's a couple things to unpack there. First of all, I understand much better now after having gone to pilgrimage to the Holy Land that most of these towns are super small. And the synagogue would be the largest building in each village, really. And it, in my opinion, it probably functioned as both a place of worship and / town hall. It seems like the public place to gather. So it just makes sense to start there, to check in there as bringing a spiritual message. But also, I would highlight what we said from the very beginning. The very first miracle that occurred in the Christian church occurred when John and Peter were headed to the temple for the Jewish evening sacrifice. It's clear evidence that early on they were doing Jewish things and Christian things simultaneously. And the Judaizers, which are this group of very legalistic, rigorous people that St. Paul is writing his letter to the Galatians about from this area, he said they're really a problem, because I'm trying to free people from the law. I'm trying to say, as Christians, you don't need to follow those practices any longer. They foreshadowed some things that Jesus wants us to have, but you no longer need to be a slave to that. And the Judaizers would come behind and say, no, you want to be Christian, you also have to be Jewish. You got to do both. Keep the Sabbath on Saturday, keep the Sabbath on Sunday, do the Jewish things, do the Christian things. So really, it already was too hard to live the Jewish things. Now you're just adding more rules and regulations. It's hard. But those things too also indicate that there was not really clear separation. It's even more clear if you read from Roman rulers when we have accounts of martyrdoms and stuff, or when the city of Rome burned. The Jews were accused of starting the fire, but the Christians were also kicked out of Rome with them. Because in the eyes of the Romans, the Jews and Christians were the same religion. They didn't see a distinction. So there's a lot of overlap there. My best guess, as far as where they worshipped, we have to go from archaeology of the Middle East, which is the house church, was the model. So for those who did believe, there would be gatherings at people's private homes. And over time, we've seen these homes get converted into kind of churches. They would build baptistries. They would build rooms of worship where people would sit and where they would have the scriptures displayed. So they go on from there to Lystra and Derbe, which is now a different state. And here's a highlight, a miracle they remembered from that time. Now in Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was a cripple from birth, who had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him, and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." There's two things about that I like. For one, it's very parallel to Peter's first miracle, which was also with the cripple. And Peter also looked at him intently. I don't know what you imagine when you see that, but Paul's like staring him down, trying to look into his soul. And whether it was a spiritual insight of the Holy Spirit or whatever, it says that Paul saw that he had the faith to be healed. These are some of the roots, the language roots of when we talk about faith healing. Does that individual person have sufficient faith to be healed? And he saw that he did. So just as Peter did in the temple grounds, Paul just says, "Get up." And he sprang up and walked. And when the crowds saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, apparently they speak a different language there, they're not speaking Greek, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul, because he was the chief speaker, they called Hermes, and the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the people. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments, Velcro, and they rushed out among the multitude, crying, "Man, why are you doing this? We also are men of like nature with you, and bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good, and gave you from heaven rains and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." With these words, they scarcely restrained themselves from offering sacrifice to them. A couple of things here. So first of all, obviously, this is not a Jewish settlement here. The featured temple of this town is a temple to Zeus. It's dedicated to Zeus. And the priests of Zeus are the ones coming out. Note, if you know anything about Greek cosmology, Zeus is the father of all the other lesser gods. He's kind of the one that looks like Yahweh. He's shown standing on top of the mountain with gray beard. And he's the father of all the demigods and what have you. Hermes is UPS of the gods, or the internet. He's got the winged helmet, and he's the one he's FedEx, okay? That gives you a little insight into these guys, because obviously one of the hints is that Barnabas is likely a lot older than Paul. He's probably the gray-haired man. He looks like, well, he doesn't talk as much, but he must be in charge. He's older. You know, in a patriarchal society, there seemed to be an assumption that Barnabas, the strong, silent type, was the one running the show, and Hermes was his mouthpiece. So Paul is the FedEx for Barnabas. But they try to worship both of them. And this, to me, it's a theme now you see through the different books that we've had. It's the way of the world versus the way of God, the spirit of the world versus the spirit of God. When Peter, you recall, when he brought the gospel to Cornelius' house in Caesarea Maritima, what was Cornelius' first instinct?
Fell down and worshipped.
He fell down on his face before Peter and he worshipped him. And what did Peter say?
I am.
Yeah, get up. I'm a man like you. What are you doing? I've come to talk to you about God, but I'm not God. Get up. So his response was immediate, rejecting idolatry. It was humble. It was redirect this guy the right direction. I'm reflecting the light of Christ. Don't get it confused though. I'm not the source of light. I'm reflecting the light. When Paul and Barnabas experienced the same problem, they also acted the same way. Get up, we are men like you, stop this. For people who've never seen the light of God, you could understand on some level where they might get confused. But what do we contrast this with? Herod Agrippa. Last time we read of the death of Herod Agrippa. People started worshiping Herod Agrippa, and he said, yeah, I like it. Give me more. I want that. And he dropped dead. So the scriptural interpretation is you weren't humble, you took the credit, you want people to worship you. You're telling people you're a God. That's unholy. That's not God's way. So we see that humility. And then they enter into a thing which is very important because it's part of our tradition. And you'll see it later when Paul gets to Athens. He tries to make an argument to them from creation. We would say from science today, because we're in such a scientific age. And the Catechism talks about it too. What, truths that are touched on in other great religions are as shadows. They're approaching the truth. It's like God preparing the soil. Various foreshadowings in different cultures of the world that ready them to receive the gospel. There's so many wonderful, amazing examples of this. But he would say to them, I'm about to clarify what you've only seen in shadow up to now, because divine revelation has the power to do that. What you were guessing at before from philosophy, I'm here to give clarity to, because I have direct information from God to teach you about this. But he says, still, you weren't walking around orphaned before because you have creation around you. That's what he's trying to say. For generations, you've walked, but not without nothing to go on. You have the heavens, the weather, the seasons, the fruitfulness of the earth. All these things hint at there is a higher power. There is intelligent design. There is order to the universe. You should see that there's all these things should lead you toward monotheism. That's kind of what he's talking about there. It is the words of the student that I shared with you a couple years ago from St. Cecilia School. I was there the day, they were like second graders. I was there in class, observing the first day these kids ever got to look through a microscope. And this girl, I'll never forget, she's one of my highlights of my journey. She just did a double take, eyes went big, and her observation, which you may or may not get at a public school, this is a faith-based school, but her shocked response, unedited, was, how can anyone look through a microscope and not believe in God? Immediately, she leapt to faith when she saw those little structures, the order, the beauty of it. If we were unbiased in our thinking, St. Paul suggests that should be everybody. We should have that experience, even if we didn't have a Bible. If all we had was just looking around at the nature around us, we should have that. But with culture, you see hints of it too. I don't have time to go into depth, but for instance, the story of St. Juan Diego and Our Lady of Guadalupe coming to Mexico. So much of the prophecies and the symbols of St. Juan Diego's tilma touched on religious customs of the local people. It just fit in place. You could see God tilling the soil, preparing it for that event. The Franciscans struggled for like 30 years, and they had less than 200 converts to show for all their labor. And after that miracle occurred, there was a Pentecost every day for the rest of Juan Diego's life. By the end, there was 8 to 10 million converts because of that event. But God prepared the soil and it took off. Another beautiful example, real quick one I'll tell you, is, I may have not shared this with some of you, in Samoa, in the islands of Samoa. I have a good affinity to that as a scuba diver. I have a lot of friends from Samoa, beautiful people. But they shared a story with me. I went to school with about 30 of them. They have their own little tribe. They formed a tribe in seminary with a chief. It was like official stuff in their cultural practices. But they shared culturally with the rest of the seminary that in ancient times in Samoa, they practiced cannibalism, ritualistic cannibalism. Not because of a shortage of food. They believed when you ate your enemy, you took on their strength. And it was a religious practice for them. It wasn't something just anybody would do, but the high chief would do. To have power over all the other peoples. And on this island, they had a lottery system set up. It's kind of like some literature stories you read, but a lottery system that by rotation, each village had to provide a victim. Year by year. And this is true history. The chief's son opposed this practice very much. And so to stop it, he couldn't make any headway with his father. He went to the village that was on the lottery that year, and he said, I volunteer. So they killed him. And when it came time for the quote-unquote feast, the father realized, hey, where's my son? And then he realized it was his son. That was the meal. How did people respond to this? Well, when missionaries came to Samoa and told the story of Jesus Christ dying so that everyone else could live, because the practice of cannibalism ended with that event, it stopped. The chief just said, we can't do this anymore, it's terrible. They said, it's like the story of the chief's son. They already kind of knew the story. And when you talk about the Eucharist as well, receiving the body and blood of Christ, even for them, that whole different level of meaning. That's the soil being prepared. God has done it amazingly in many parts of the world. crazy when you hear early missionary stories. It's mind-blowing. Anyway, so he appeals to that, and this is the response he gets from this intellectual appeal. It says from verse 19, but Jews came there from Antioch and Iconium. This is the place that he was just at, if you're noticing. These are the last two villages where a riot came. They weren't happy enough to kick him out of their village. They went and got a U-Haul, and they formed a convoy, and they followed St. Paul with all their energy to say, we're going to be the plague on your house, wherever you go. So they've now arrived from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the people, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city. The only unique detail about this, stoning, I guess, was a worldwide practice, but for the Jews, you would take the victim outside the city walls first, because that would render a place unclean. So they would take the person out of the living space and then stone them to death. For the pagans, they just, Main Street works, they stoned him in downtown, and then dragged his body out of the city for disposal. But they stoned him. Both of them. When the disciples gathered about them, he rose up and entered the city. And on the next day, he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. He has an account in his letters later on, and this is only midpoint in his life. He tells how many times he was scourged, how many times beaten with rods, how many times stoned to death, how many shipwrecks he was in, on and on. It's just a horrifying list of sufferings that he did for the gospel. This is one of those times. He actually says that he was left for dead. He was stoned by all outward signs. You know, they didn't have modern medical machinery, but they presumed he was dead. Like, we did a sufficient job. There's blood. He's not moving. They left him. But his disciples surrounded him, kind of to protect the body, and eventually he regained consciousness. He probably looked like a car wreck, but he actually survived the stoning. And it says they went to Derbe, the next town over. And when they had preached the gospel to the city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, to Iconium, and to Antioch. Think about that for a moment. That could be a Passover line. But after what I just said, these guys are following you everywhere. Now you have the boldness not only to go back in the town that just stoned you, but now you're retracing this step and you're going back to every town where you started a riot. I don't know about you, I do not have that level of courage. That's the courage of the Holy Spirit. But that's St. Paul. That's a fiery guy.
So when they shook off their sandals and went, he actually came back.
He did come back.
So
It's more like a temporary, I'm not pleased with you.
the curse is still kind of left up to the Holy Spirit. I mean, he still could be preparing them for the next round, right?
I'm sure, because the law of love and mercy is that you don't give up.
Right.
So even though you might express your displeasure ritually, I think you don't give up. You got to keep trying. It could be one more soul. Save one soul. That's amazing to me that he had that ability. We know that from the legend of Peter too, near the end of his life, when rumor was they're going to arrest you, Peter, they're going to put you to death, and so he leaves Rome. And it's hard to sort out whether it's tradition or legend, but according to the story, he has a vision of Jesus. He's going out of the city, and coming toward him on the road is Jesus. And Jesus says to him, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm getting the heck out of Dodge, because they're going to kill me." "Where are you going?" And Jesus said, "I'm going to Rome to be crucified again." And Peter turns around and goes back into Rome. Our natural inclination is to flee the cross. But Jesus is saying, "No, this is the witness. You need to give it." So when you think of these guys, we say the church was built on the blood of martyrs. Sometimes that's a throwaway line. If you really take it into your heart and realize what that is entailing, it's mind-blowing to me. When I see people in my modern life, another one of my milestones, you've heard this story. It's been a few years since I told it, but when I was a Carmelite friar, I'll never forget this guy. Pope John Paul II ordered that all male religious orders, every province in the world, establish a mission in Africa. At one point, it was a message to the World Council of Religious Orders for Men. And he said, "This is the battlefront. This is where Islam and Christianity are at war. You need to be there." every one of you need to establish a mission. So, in the U.S., our order had 3 provinces, East Coast, Central, and West. I was part of the Western province from the Rocky Mountains to the coast. We established a mission in Uganda. The East Coast established one in Rwanda. And we didn't have enough men to spare. They said at a minimum you need 3 priests. So we each took kind of on loan some international clergy. Some places like Poland and other places had more vocations, but we formed houses. And I wasn't even prepared to go to Uganda before I became diocesan. But this fellow was a priest from Poland. And they formed an international house. It was a Polish priest, I think an Italian priest, and one of our priests from the East Coast. And they were there when the civil war broke out in Rwanda. When people were being killed by machete, tens of thousands of people killed, and just bodies left along the road between the Hutus and the Tutsis. It was tribal warfare, but sadly there were Catholics on both sides. This bloody, horrible, evil event. And this mission, they were preaching against the government and preaching for calmness and peace, and essentially they were preaching the gospel. Their superior, one day he's running errands or whatever, he doesn't come home. He disappeared. And they tried from the police to find what they could. It's a very corrupt system at the time. 3 days later they found his body. He was killed, tortured and killed by machete. They found his body along the road. So there were 2 left, and they had to have this serious conversation. Should we stay or should we leave? They decided they were going to stay because they're looking at the people. And they're saying, if we leave, we're leaving them to this horrible situation. I think it's the next week, the second priest was killed during Mass. So he's giving out communion. You're sort of in a vulnerable state. You can't really move. We're in the middle of the Mass. The guy comes up last in line with a gun and shot him point blank in the chest. They left this Polish priest by himself. And they made offers to him. We can send a helicopter, we can get you out of there. He said no. He became a refugee with his people, and they disappeared for like 2 years off the grid. They were crossing country borders and everything. He was presumed dead. Then one day after things calmed down, he called and said, hey, just checking in. To his mother house in Poland. And they said, you need to come home and debrief. And he was reluctant, but holy obedience, he did it. And they gave him a mandatory 6-month retreat. They said, you've been through trauma, whether you want to admit it or not. You need to think about this. And then as a result of the suffering you've gone through, essentially the Vatican said, name your assignment, wherever you want to serve in the world. We want you to discern this over your retreat time. The last month of his retreat was at my monastery. So I got to see this guy close up, and the thing that struck me the most, I was looking for signs of trauma, signs of his, scars, emotional scars. It just struck me so ordinary. Not only that, but very humorous, like joy-filled, telling jokes, always laughing, permanent smile. It's like, you would never guess this about him. And it's probably rude of me to ask, but he was coming down to his last 2 or 3 days. And